We could just sit here and listen to the rain. The stillness within, the rain without. The main point of being here, as I'm sure you know, is not the words or the knowledge, information, but the energy field of presence. So from one point of view, you could say it's a transmission of presence, but it doesn't go just one way. The energy frequency or consciousness frequency of presence within you responds. And this is how the collective energy field in the room arises. And it can be extremely beneficial and powerful to spend some time in that collective energy field. So you get a boost of presence. Very important is your degree of openness to it. And that's determined to a large extent by how much or how little mind activity happens within you as you sit here. You may have noticed you don't really need to think about what you're hearing. It's too simple. So there's nothing much to think about as you sit here. You cannot add very much to being here by adding some thoughts to it. You can only lose your presence here by losing yourself in pointless thinking. So the arising of presence is closely connected with the cessation of compulsive thinking. Compulsive thinking is the one addiction that affects almost everybody on the planet. And that is what we awaken out of. When we talk about awakening, people say, but I'm awake already. They are not, because they go through life and perceive whatever they perceive outside, interpret whatever is happening outside through the stream of compulsive thinking. And that screen of compulsive thinking and continuous interpretation and continuous like and dislike and calling it good or bad, that is the dream that you are immersed in. So you don't really encounter reality, you encounter your own mind, the conditioning of your mind, no matter where you go. And the realization that that operates in you is the beginning of awakening. And the realization that there is conditioned thinking in you, compulsive thinking, that realization can only come from the part of you that is awakening. Whatever we want to call that, presence, awareness, stillness, pure consciousness. And that's vast, a vast depths within you compared to the surface phenomenon of thinking. And the sad truth is that most people go through their entire life unaware of the vast depths within them, identified only with the surface phenomenon of thought activity and perceptions which are colored by mental interpretations, obscured by mental interpretations. And their entire sense of self, of who they are, which is a very vital thing, your sense of identity, that is the very basis for how you live, how you respond to life, to situations, to other human beings. Your very sense of identity is bound up then with the surface activity of conditioned thinking. And certain repetitive thought patterns in your mind then form the core of your sense of identity. And we can call that the ego, we can call that the self or the false self. There was a famous man who said, I'll tell you in a minute who, the true value of a human being is determined by the degree to which he or she is free of self. Now you might think perhaps somebody, a spiritual teacher in India said that, but it was actually Albert Einstein who said that. If he hadn't been a scientist, he would have been a spiritual teacher. The true value of a human being is determined by the degree to which he or she is free of the self. Now that's an interesting statement. And modern man would say, what do you mean? Do you mean that some human beings are more valuable than others? Yes and no. There is something that we could call the intrinsic value of every human being, where every human being is one with the source of all life, the unmanifested source of all life. Every human being is one with that and connected with that. In that sense, every human being is of equal value, because in essence, every human being is a manifestation of the One. In the outer realm, or the outer dimension of manifestation, and this is what Einstein was talking about, there's only a certain amount of light that comes through the form of this human being. Light, I mean the light of consciousness, the light of the unconditioned consciousness. Most human beings have a certain density about them, and that is the density of the mind and the emotions that go with that, the density of conditioned mind structures, of the ego, of the self, and the degree of density varies from person to person, and that determines how much of the light of the unconditioned comes through a human being. Light, I'm using it metaphorically, it's the light of consciousness. Nothing to do, very little to do with developed intelligence. You can have a very simple human being, very uneducated human being who is much more translucent to the light than somebody who is highly educated. Not necessarily, but... So in that sense, every human being then, and this is what Einstein was talking about, manifests that transcendent dimension, and that's determined by the density or lack of density in your mental or psychic structure. And so another way of looking at why we are here is that we are losing the density of the self, of a rigidly defined, form-based sense of identity. So we are becoming lighter, so to speak. You have all met people with heavy personality structures, and perhaps if you can then see when you meet a person who is very much identified with their personality, with rigid roles they play, rigid opinions they hold and interpretations, they're completely identified with the mind-made, dense sense of self. You can observe it when you meet people sometimes, and when you see it in another, it doesn't mean you're judging the other. You're only judging the other human being if you mistake the self, the density, ultimately the illusion, for who that human being is in essence. That is called judgment. And whenever you judge another, your judgment is also a thought form that arises in you, that you believe in. The moment you judge another, which means you're confusing who they are in their primordial state of connectedness with being, you're confusing that with the conditioned behavior they manifest, the ego, the self. The moment you judge another and believe in your judgment, you yourself have become trapped in the self. So the ego strengthens itself through judgment of others. Because when you judge another, you believe in what you're saying, you believe that is the reality of that human being. And that belief is a mind form that arises in you. And at the moment you believe in it, you are identified with the mind form that arises in you, which means you yourself are trapped in ego. So you see how dangerous it is to judge another. And really, the moment you judge another, you're judging yourself, because you become trapped in the same thing. And the moment you relinquish judgment of another, you yourself have become open, a space has opened up within you, and there's a possibility for the other human being perhaps to find him, herself also outside of the mind structures. The opportunity is there. You are here to provide that opening. You can only do that if you become familiar with the state of not compulsively imposing judgments on whatever arises around you. And so this is a wonderful practice, and we are practicing it here, not judging this moment in any way, allowing it to be. And whatever arises in this moment, allowing whatever arises to be, and then see if action is required. It comes out of the state of allowing, not of the state of denial. Completely different action arises. So that you become free of ego, which seems like a huge task. How can I become free of my ego? It's very simple. The exit point lies in the present moment, where you let go of identification with thinking. So when I say that, you see, don't necessarily say that you need to be completely free of thinking, because thinking will continue to arise. But you can be aware when thought arises that this is or normal in a thought. It calls it good, it calls it bad, it calls this person something, perhaps habitually. You no longer completely believe in every thought that arises in your mind. So there's a space between you and your thoughts. That's an enormous freedom, and that's part of the awakening. The unawakened person believes in every thought that arises. The thought comes into their head, and they are completely, oh, that's how it is. And then another thought, that's how it is. Or thoughts of doubt come, oh, maybe it's that, oh, no, that. But every time a thought comes, they're in it. That's called identification. To make identified, the root of the word is to make the same. Idem, the same. When you make something the same, you identify what the same as what? The same as I, as if you were it. That is the unawakened state of identification with thinking, and that is the self that arises through continuous identification with thinking. And that is the density that prevents a greater intelligence and aliveness and infinite potential to come through this form out of another dimension, the unconditioned, the timeless, the uncreated. It comes out of that and shines from there, through this form, into this world. And for some reason, I don't know why, I know that that's what it wants. If you can even call it wanting, any word that you have in our dimension doesn't really apply. We can just use approximations and parables and so on. So I know that from my own insight and from others who've experienced, gone through that process and confirmed throughout history for thousands of years, that that which really cannot be spoken of, which is sometimes called by a word consisting of 3 letters, which I don't mention so much because of so many misperceptions around it, that wants to shine from where it already exists timelessly and in complete fullness. It wants to enter this dimension. Perhaps it wants to transform this dimension into itself. Perhaps it wants to spiritualize the entire physical universe. Whatever we say about it, it would be absurd to believe that through the conceptual mind we could understand and verbalize the inconceivable process that is at work here. We can align ourselves with it. Yes, that's why we're here. We are not here to understand it conceptually, because that would be impossible. It would be futile. Our heads would start fuming. The uncreated in that dimension. I don't understand. Well, I hope not. That reminds me of a nice little Zen story that actually supposedly happened. The master goes to the disciple and in the usual Zen, somewhat brusque manner says, "Do you understand Zen?" And the disciple says, "No, master, I don't." And the master says, "Neither do I." Now the only difference here between the disciple and the master is the disciple doesn't know, but thinks he should know. He should work something out mentally. The master doesn't know and is happy with the state of not knowing, completely at ease in the state of not knowing, which basically means the state of not thinking. He's in the state that from the point of view of thinking looks like ignorance, and that's his home. So he lives in that alive stillness without thinking, I need to work something out. In that sense, as the master rightly said, he doesn't know Zen either, but completely different. In the same way, whenever I come to talk, I come here from my room, or wherever it is, there's always this feeling, I have nothing to say. So what am I going to say? I have no idea. There's nothing there. They know it all already. What can you add to this beautiful moment? And so then I sit here, still, when there's silence for the simple reason that I don't know what to say. And this could be a nightmare if I believed that I needed to know what to say. But if I can be comfortable with the state of not knowing, the state of not knowing becomes a deepening. It's a very deep state. And the moment you become comfortable with not knowing and not interpreting and not evaluating and not calling it this or that, there's the deepening. Become comfortable with the state of seeming ignorance. It's deeper than ignorance, but the conceptual mind is very afraid of it. It says, don't go there, you become an idiot. So you become comfortable with not knowing, and suddenly you can sense the depths within you, and there's a trust, and you know that that depth is vast, and you know if there's anything to say, it will come out of the depths. And that's and then it actually becomes beautiful and extremely enjoyable not to know. Or, and this does not just apply to giving a talk, you can meet another human being. I sometimes meet new people, and then occasionally it happens that somebody asks me a day later or a few hours later, what did you think of such and such a person? And I go, I don't know. Because there wasn't any thinking, there was just the space for that person. And then I have to start thinking to get an answer. And usually it's not that great what then comes. I don't know what they are. It's unnecessary to judge the other. And the interaction is deeply enjoyable when you come from the state of not knowing, and because that's where the depth arises in you. And that is it has certain similarities with what traditionally in some mythologies and fairy tales or some literature, there is something called the fool. The fool is a simple, very simple person, and often in myths, for example, you have it in the Hobbit, in the Lord of the Rings, in a more recent example, a very simple person, and for some reason the simple person in these various myths has a very important task. Only he or she can be entrusted with this. All the more intelligent, more evolved humans, they cannot carry out the tasks that only this simpleton can carry out. And that's an ancient motive. Now the simpleton is somebody who is relatively ignorant. He still lives in deeper connectedness with the source because he is not yet lost in conceptual thinking, as like everybody else. And because the simpleton is not yet lost in conceptual thinking, he has that deeper connection still with the source, with being. And therefore, only the simpleton can be entrusted with this vital task that nobody else. And there's a deep truth in that, expressed in stories and so on. Even in films like Forrest Gump, where this person has no ego and he always does good things and always life supports him. He still lives in a pre-egoic stage. And so this is a state of ignorance that is pre-thought, prior to the arising of excessive thinking and identification with thinking, which is ego. And then you have a state that from an external viewpoint looks similar, could almost be confused with the state of the fool, and that's the state of having gone beyond identification with thinking and again be rooted in your own depths and be connected with the vastness of being within you. And yet there's both a similarity between the two states of the fool and the enlightened master, and there's a vital difference too between those states, and that is when you transcend thinking, there is a deep knowing of your connectedness with the source, and that dimension of knowing is the dimension of awareness. Awareness becomes aware of itself, or consciousness becomes conscious of itself. So you regain, one could say, the lost state, paradise regained. You regain that which was once lost, but when you regain that which was once lost, you regain it at a much deeper level. There's an added dimension of knowing there. And that, of course, is also in the New Testament the parable of the prodigal son, the lost son, who leaves his father's home, squanders all his wealth, becomes a beggar, becomes destitute, even forgets who he is, and then messengers come and tell him, "Don't you know who you are?" And gradually there's a return. When he returns to his father's home, it says he is loved more deeply than before. That really what the story is trying to express, that at the time could have not been expressed in any other way, is the added dimension that is there when you regain that which was lost. So humanity as a whole once lived in that state of innocent connectedness with being, the source, like as nature still does, animals, trees, plants. That's why there's something when you perceive nature, there's always there's something speaks from there. There's a strong feeling. If you're not burdened, if you're not imposing excessive thinking on it, you can sense that every animal has that quiet rootedness in being, of its that integrity. It is completely one with itself, the animal and the tree, and it hasn't separated itself from being. It hasn't created a separate identity. The animal, as I sometimes put it, the animal does not have a relationship with itself. The animal is itself. It is one with itself, it is one with being. It does not inhabit a world of problems. Only humans have a relationship with themselves. Weird thing. I like myself. I don't like myself. I love myself. I hate myself. Can you see the split that has happened? There's me and myself, and I don't like myself. That's the split of Narcissus, the ancient myth, and again the truth is often expressed in ancient times in myths. Narcissus was the young man who lived a long time ago, according to ancient Greek myths. At the time there were no mirrors, but accidentally one day this man saw his own reflection in a pool of water, and he went, "Oh, how beautiful." And the story goes, he fell in love with himself. You can see the arising of a split. Suddenly he had an image of who he was. And my interpretation of that is not so much that he fell in love with himself, that he became obsessed with himself, with the image of himself. So here you have suddenly a visual representation of the arising of a mind-made sense of self, an image self. And then you suddenly begin to have a relationship with yourself. And then life becomes problematic. Because you've become schizophrenic in the old sense of split, in a split that has happened. And that split is not there in the fool. The fool does not have a sense of self, he just acts out of the simplicity of his or her being. And then you go through the problematic stage, which took a few thousand years, for mankind, humanity, to travel through the stage of ego and so on. We had to go through it. Why did we have to go through it? Well, we went through it. That's why we had to go through it. And so we are coming out of that, and we are now at this transitional stage where we are partly still in the old consciousness where we have a relationship with ourselves, and partly in the state of freedom from the self. That's really what it is. Freedom from the self, where the density of the mind, the identified mind, lessens more and more. And then life becomes much easier, because the density, when you live through the density of the mind structure, the egoic self, then this inner density is reflected in outer reality also, and you inhabit a very problematic universe, because you impose all that enormous amount of misinterpretation on the world and on other people. So what arises then is freedom from a false sense of self, what Einstein called the free of self. And he said something else in connection with that, and that is, he called the usual sense of identity or sense of self that human beings have, he called that an optical illusion of consciousness. So your usual sense of self is an optical illusion of consciousness. You are mistaking certain forms that arise in your mind for who you are. Those thought forms are only temporary forms that consciousness has taken, and you identify with them and believe that that's who you are, and that's the self. So for thousands of years people have lived in a false sense of self. It began with a tribal, collective sense of us and them, a tribal sense of self. Gradually became more and more complex and differentiated. And even nowadays still, most humans, they are looking for a stronger or enhanced sense of self. And they are looking, these days more than ever before, because the sense of self that people inherit is not quite as rigid as it used to be in our, especially in modern cultures. In older cultures, you already inherited a ready-made sense of self. You've had your family, you identified with your family, you identified with your ancestors. And even nowadays in certain cultures, some people still derive the largest part of their sense of who they are, or the whole part of who they are from their ancestors. You have their pictures on the walls, and you have a whole line of ancestors behind you, and you're aware of them, and you are in front, and then you become trapped in that kind of very rigid sense of who you are, determined by the past. And yet many humans these days, especially in relatively new countries, you don't have that. There are very few people, there are some probably, but not that many people in Australia who derive their sense of who they are from their ancestors. There may be some. You may derive your sense of self from if you're an Aboriginal, you can derive your sense of self from that, but even that becomes a limitation. Even there, you have to go beyond that. Most Australians then, they're looking like Americans, and many even Europeans. You look for, there's always a sense of, I'm not sufficiently myself, I don't know, so I need to add something to myself. And so society and people, they're always on the lookout. What can be added to make my sense of self more complete? And of course, whatever you add is really another illusion. So you look at all kinds of things, and there's a whole industry has developed to provide you with something that you can add to your sense of self. There's whole magazines that are mostly designed to give you a sense of self, to show you how you can be truly yourself. If you buy this product, you will be more yourself. You will be unique. You really be who you are, who you want to be. Or you look to celebrities, what they do, and then you imitate that. And there's always a search, what can I add to me to make myself feel more complete? There's nothing wrong with adding experiences and even adding possessions. But if you're looking for yourself through those things, you're condemned to continuous frustration. Because no matter what you add to yourself, and if you're more advanced, you may want to add knowledge. I really want to understand the universe. And I want to add, there's nothing wrong with knowledge, it's a wonderful thing. But if through that knowledge you want to get an enhanced sense of self, all you get is an enhanced trap. Because if you acquire a lot of knowledge and you identify with that knowledge, You become a knowledgeable person. You're identified with your, and of course, not all of that may be true knowledge. A lot of opinions masquerade as knowledge. So many people's minds are full of opinions masquerading as knowledge. They can't differentiate between an opinion, a thought that is an opinion, which means just one viewpoint, well, one of many possible viewpoints, and they mistake that for knowledge. They say, this is how it is, this is how they are, thinking they know. It's an absurd delusion, but millions of people are still trapped in that. Not realizing that they're stuffed full with opinions. And what is an opinion? It's a thought. And you identify with the thought. And when you identify with the thought, it becomes a mental position that you are trapped in. So the more you're trapped in opinions, the more and you get a stronger sense of self. But the stronger sense of self, it's satisfying. Yes, when you can voice your opinions and everybody else is wrong, of course, maybe you're the only person who is right, and you get a very strong sense of self from that. Or you can complain if you have nothing else to identify with. You go around just complaining about everybody. They're all fools, all the politicians are fools, and they're all fools, and you are the only one who is not a fool. There are people like that, quite a few. And so they don't realize, it's satisfying for a while to the ego, it's satisfying. It's not a pleasant state at all, but the ego mistakes pain and pleasure. So what is really a state of an unsatisfactory state, the ego says, oh, this is pleasurable, I love fighting with others and showing them that I'm right. So this is content, identification with the content of your mind, stuffed full with opinions. Or it might even be knowledge. Maybe you have a lot of knowledge about whatever subject or you're interested in, and that's nothing wrong with that, it's beautiful. But are you deriving an enhanced sense of self from that, and then you show others that you are much more knowledgeable than they are? I was like that for a while, a few years of my life. I didn't have much else to identify with, so I was in search of an identity in my 20s, felt a bit lost. I didn't have a whole line of illustrious ancestors that I could identify with, not knowing much beyond my grandfather. Who were my ancestors before my grandfather? Don't know. So I didn't have that. Okay, what? I feel as there's something lacking here. I felt I'm nobody. I'm lost. I've no identity. Then I lived in, not even in my own country. I wasn't identified with any country anymore. Where do I belong? I was looking for something, and finally I found something. Well, I couldn't have good looks. I didn't have that, or a strong body and felt everybody's looking, didn't have that. So I finally found something, and that was knowledge. So I started reading more and more, and then after a while I could talk very knowledgeably about philosophy and all kinds of things. And well, part of me was looking for some answer, this is true, because there was something missing. I needed some answer to the dilemma of life. Part of me was looking for an answer, but another strong part of me was looking for an enhanced sense of self through the knowledge. So I spent more and more years and became an intellectual. And finally, I was somebody. I accumulated more and more knowledge, and I was beginning to impress people with my knowledge. And I could say things, and I could show them I knew more than they, but at the same time, retrospectively, I now realize I was continuously ill at ease within, because there was always the possibility of meeting others who knew much more than you. And then when I started going to university, I did meet them. There were always others, they know even more, oh my God. And so then there was that trapped in that sense of self for a while, until finally it collapsed, because that sense of self became more and more unhappy. There was no fulfillment in identifying with knowledge at all. The sense of self just became more and more uneasy and unhappy with itself. And there was still something vital missing, and I didn't know what it was. So identification with knowledge or identification with opinions, really, one could almost say every thought that arises is only a viewpoint, is only a temporary perspective on whatever the thought talks about. Even a scientific truth, which is called knowledge, objective knowledge, is not an ultimate truth, because even that changes. After a few hundred years, what was true then is no longer true now. So even that changes. So even there, when we speak of objective knowledge, it's not ultimate truth that can ever be arrived at through any kind of thought. So there's nothing wrong with thought, but if we take thought as an absolute and look for ourselves in it, that's the illusion. So the vital thing then is, where does your sense of self come? What is your identity? What is the main part of your identity? Is it what you, these days, as I said, it may not be your ancestors anymore, but in most cases it's perhaps what you do. Perhaps you derive your identity from what you do for a living, and that's usually what people will ask you when they meet you. They want to assess who you are. And so they ask you. In the past, they wouldn't ask you what do you do. They would ask you, who are you? What's your name? What's your family? Where do you live? Where's your palace or whatever? What's your title? That was determined because you didn't do anything. If you belonged to the aristocracy, you didn't really work unless you had a nice hobby. And that's where the term working class came from, because there were people who worked and people who didn't have to work. And that was nice for them. So you wouldn't ask an aristocrat, what do you do? You ask, who are you? Well, you would already know who they are. And so some people still have that a little bit, and that's fine. Here is, what do you do? And so you say, well, I'm an investment banker. And that, until recently, was a thing that was admired. But you see how quickly things can change. And how quickly a satisfying sense of identity can turn into the opposite. So instead of proudly declaring what you do, you mumble something. As long as the word finance doesn't come into it, or investment. So, and we all know cases of people who were so identified with their job that when they lost their job, they didn't just lose their job, they were lost. They were suddenly lost because they had identified with their job, their social position that came with the job. Their whole sense of purpose was bound up with their activity. And suddenly the boss comes and says, I'm sure you've heard of the economic downturn and recession, and so I'm afraid we will have to, as the wonderful expression goes, we will have to let you go. And there you are, suddenly, the question then, at the next party, somebody asks you, what do you do? You go, don't know. And that can be an existential crisis for many people, a deep existential crisis. If you were completely identified with your position and your doing, you will encounter deep despair when suddenly all the things that gave you your identity are removed. And that's happening to many people these days. Is that a bad thing? Well, in conventional terms, yes. in reality it is not a bad thing, because a great opportunity opens up when you lose something that ultimately was an illusion. You become disillusioned, and that's a wonderful thing. The illusion, suddenly you're nobody in the eyes of the world and in your own eyes. And that's an opportunity. Either you become very unhappy, and then you become trapped in a new identity and a new little story that complains about how unfairly life has treated you, or you blame certain people for what has happened to you, or groups of people. So you could immediately substitute your old sense of identity, which isn't there anymore, with a new sense of identity where you see yourself as the victim in your own little story. Ah, well then, at least you know who you are. I'm the victim of such and such people or such and such circumstances. Oh, that's satisfying. At least I know who I am. It's not a pleasant story, but let me tell you about it. It's a sad story. But it will tell you who I am. So you can quickly seek another illusion and get trapped in that. And the mind often tries to do that. It comes up with some story where you fit in again. Maybe this time it's not a happy one. Before it was a happy story. And now it's the unhappy me. But at least you still think you know who you are. It's another delusion. But the opportunity when a loss arises of something that you had identified with, that is what we call, as I mentioned last night, the words of Leonard Cohen's song, the crack. When the crack appears, there's a crack. And sooner or later, in everything that you identify with, the crack appears, because it's not real. Sooner or later, the crack will have to appear. So when a crack appears in your sense of self, it may be more than a crack. It may be a big gaping hole appears in your sense of self. Ooh. Oh my God. And in the beautiful lines of that song, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets through or gets in. And that is, what is that crack? That crack is a crack in the density of the egoic sense of self. And to the egoic sense of self, that is a painful thing. But if you can stay with it and not resist that sense of not, do you remember what we said a little earlier? Not knowing. If you can embrace or become comfortable with the sense of no longer knowing who you are, and just, okay, I'm no longer an investment banker and I'm no longer anything in particular, I don't know who I am. Instead of immediately seeking some substitute mind structure, stay with not knowing. Be the fool, like the fool, but beyond the fool. The state of not knowing, and suddenly you sense there is suddenly a depth to who you are, which you didn't know when the crack wasn't there yet, because you were the surface. You were identified only with the surface of life. And that was the dreadful limitation of whatever mind-made identity you have, and if the world tells you you're the greatest, you're still completely trapped in a very limited sense of self. When the crack appears, the depth is also there suddenly. But you have to stay for a while with the not knowing. Become comfortable with this wonderful state of not having a particular opinion about yourself anymore. Well, who am I? You don't need to know who you are, just be still for a moment. Don't impose any noise. You're not some noise that arises. Put a few letters together, pronounce them and say, that's me. Just a few, how many letters are there in the alphabet? I can't remember, 20 something, 26? So you put a little combination of these letters, it gives you a little story, and then the letters become sounds that come out of your mouth, and that's who I am. And you tell the same story to yourself in your head. Isn't that a dreadful limitation? Just a combination of a few sounds in your head, or spoken out loud, and you think that's who you are. No, the animal knows better, because they don't think, the dog doesn't think the dog is a dog. The dog is connected with a depth, and that's why when you look at a dog, you feel there's such a genuineness, such a simplicity, such a innocence, such a oneness with being there, that's why people feel attracted to animals, because they find something there that they can no longer find in themselves. But of course it is there, it is in you, and so welcome the crack in whatever form it appears, or this gaping hole that suddenly appears in your life, and welcome the state of not knowing. But don't wait for the crack or the gaping hole to appear. Welcome the state of not knowing here and now already. You won't become a fool. There is no way going back. You're not going to become Forrest Gump. You're not going to become the Hobbit. No matter how nice it would be to be a Hobbit. You don't regress back. You transcend the mind-identified state. And that is the beauty. And that's no longer deriving your sense of who you are from the content of your mind. Okay, says the mind, then who am I if I'm not the content of your mind? And whatever you say then, of course, is some new thought. But we can use some words as pointers, and we can say, as I say somewhere in The Stillness Speaks, you're never more essentially yourself than when you are still. So when you become still, not sleep, not going to sleep, not moving towards unconsciousness, when you become still, that space opens up, that is behind the crack. And that opens up even without the crack. Suddenly, you're not identified with any content. Suddenly, the stillness, you realize, is the space in which the content exists temporarily as a thought form, as whatever. Become still and realize that formless presence is more essentially who you are than anything you could identify with in the world of form. And even when you derive your sense of identity from some story that you are telling yourself and others, even there, really, indirectly, you are deriving your identity from the consciousness in which the story exists. The little bit of light that shines through the story, that sense of I, the deep I, that's hiding in the story, is not really the story, it's the consciousness that shines through the story. Without the story could not be told. You're only telling the story of me because in the light of consciousness this form appears temporarily. And so the sense of you get of who you are through the story is really an indirect sense of who you are beyond the story. What I'm saying now might sound a little complicated, but that's ultimately there's only one identity, there's only one, you're only ever that which we could call the primordial I, not the form-based I. When people say I, perhaps the most commonly used word in the language, when people use I, usually they refer to the story of me, my mind-made sense of self. Me is the body and the name and my history, and that's I. I like, I don't like, I want, I must have, I need. And that's an illusion ultimately. There is another sense in which you can use I, and that I expresses the ultimate and the deepest truth of who you are, and that I is beingness itself. Life before it becomes form. Life in its timeless and formless state, you could say. Whatever word we use is not quite right. So realizing that that's who you are frees you from looking for yourself in the world of mental forms and deriving some substitute identity from that. So when you have lost your job, you can use that opportunity of embracing the state of no longer having to define to yourself and others who you are. That's a wonderful state of freedom. And so I lived in that state, I still do, but there was a stage when, for many years, my so-called life, there's no such thing as my life, I'm just using those words. You are life, you don't have a life, there's no such thing as my life, but let's just use these conventional words. My life was not successful on the surface of things. I had given up a career and went into nowhere, drifted around for a while. Now, if I had had an opinion about myself and defined my life, I would have become very unhappy. What have I done with my life? Well, this is what it has come to. I have no income, no regular income, I have no insurance policy, no pension scheme, I don't even have a home to call my own, I have no prospects anymore, I'm getting too old, nobody wants to employ me, what's the point of it all? That's the sad story of me. And here I am sitting on a park bench with nothing to do. That could have been very unhappy. If I had lived through a mental story, would have been an unhappy state. Luckily, I was no longer living through a mental story and I was sitting on a park bench and it was a beautiful moment. Breathing, the trees, the sky, sensing the underlying presence. No, there's no unhappy story, there's just the beautiful spaciousness of this moment. What's unhappy about this? Nothing. What about the future, says the mind? What about next year? It didn't arise very much because the beauty of the now was too wonderful. So that was great. Other people thought my life wasn't that great anymore. That was okay, I had to allow them their opinion. And then forward 20 years or whatever, and suddenly the same person has become somebody, has a form identity, is called a spiritual teacher or an author. Oh, now I am somebody. Now, if I had taken this opportunity to take up again the story of me, on the surface it would look satisfying. I have become a great spiritual teacher now. Finally, after all these dreadful years of being nobody, I've become somebody. And with that, of course, would arise all kinds of things, would arise of how do other people see me? Am I going to be able to sustain my reputation as a spiritual teacher? Am I going to satisfy them when I give another talk? Or is it all kinds of things. The mental images are never that stable. There's always a sense of insecurity around them. And I would feel, okay, all these people have come to see me would be very stressful to think, oh my God, am I going to satisfy all these people? Am I going to show them that I'm a great spiritual teacher? Life would become stressful. I would become trapped in some new identity, and gradually the density would reassert itself, and the talks would become, well, nobody would come anymore. So not to take up some new identity, it's such freedom in not feeling that you are anybody in particular and that you need to have that. You can still play with, you have an identity. When people ask me, sometimes I meet people somewhere when I travel, what do you do? And I have quick answers so that we don't get involved in some kind of explanation. Just say, I'm an author. Okay, what kind of books? All spiritual books, and sometimes they ask no more questions after that. If there's a true opening and they ask a true question, then that's a different situation. Then suddenly words come, and it's an alive interaction. So you can't say I'm an author without truly believing that that's your identity. It's something temporary. It's a form that arises. So the freedom then of living without a form-based identity, not relinquishing, saying you don't have to tell anybody that you no longer have a form-based identity. Because the moment you tell somebody, you have a new identity, because you're then somebody who has a no form-based identity. The mind is very tricky. Right? And then with that comes the freedom then, where when loss comes into your life, it is no longer experienced, loss of whatever you had identified with, it's no longer experienced as extremely painful. It's just, oh, it's gone. There's an ancient Sufi saying that goes something like this: the heart weeps for what it has lost, and the spirit laughs for what it has found. And this is the great opportunity that comes with any kind of loss. But we don't have to wait for that. Loss comes sooner or later anyway. It's part of living in this world of form, of fleeting forms. Don't wait for the crack to appear. And this is the beauty of the spiritual teaching, is what you voluntarily embrace the state of not knowing, of pure, you could say, pure aware presence. And feel that's your home. Your home is not in the world of form. You're a visitor in the world of form, so to speak. It's temporary. The very form that you are is temporary. The name, the physical form is temporary. It's not going to last. And as the Buddha said, identification with form, this is a very free translation, identification with the impermanent is suffering. If you're seeking for yourself in the impermanent, you will always find sooner or later, and usually sooner, suffering. And that in itself is fine too. It's your teacher. All those who have not yet come into contact with a spiritual teaching or teacher, they also have a spiritual teacher. It's called suffering. And sooner or later, the suffering brings about an awakening. Awakening out of identification with form. And identification with form is primarily identification with thoughts, because that's where all the forms actually take place. And so this is why the Zen master said, when he was looking at people, and some people were looking for enlightenment, and some others were looking for the truth, or looking for their true selves, whatever. And the Zen master said, you don't need to look for the truth, you don't need to look for enlightenment, just stop cherishing opinions. That's all you need to do. What does that mean? Stop cherishing opinions. We talked about it earlier. What is an opinion? A mind form that arises and that you are identified with and believe in it. Stop cherishing opinions does not mean stop having opinions. You can have opinions. You can have an opinion whether George W. Bush was a good president or bad president. You can have that opinion. The question is, what he called cherishing opinions is to really, that means identified with the opinion. And that's where the delusion lies. Be trapped in your opinions. So instead of seeking for enlightenment, just stop cherishing opinions. Meaning, don't identify with mental positions. And then, who you are beyond the mind suddenly appears. Who you are beyond form suddenly appears when you let go of identification with form. So you don't need to look for God. Oh, I shouldn't have mentioned that word. You don't need to look for that which cannot be named, because when you let go of that which obscures that which cannot be named, that which cannot be named is always already present as the deepest truth of who you are, not separate from who you are. So it is always already here and now, just obscured in the same way that you could obscure the sun if you put on blinkers or mask or completely dark glasses. You could obscure the sun. It doesn't make any difference to the sun, but you don't see it. So a spiritual teaching is showing you how easily it can become obscured and how easily it can also stand revealed, the truth of who you are beyond form. That's our practice here, the realization of that. Remember to embrace the state of not knowing. Also be innocent when you walk around here and contemplate the forms of nature. Be innocent. Don't impose a lot of conceptualization on what you're seeing. And that's part of that practice. you don't even need to say, what's this called? I was quite happy when I saw this huge thing yesterday come and close the patio. A huge prehistoric animal. I don't know what it's called, but I was happy not knowing. If somebody wants to tell me, that's fine. But to have to be there and be the space for this to arise is a wonderful thing. It's miraculous. The continuous conceptualization gives you the illusion that you know. When you name something, you think you know what it is. It's an illusion. All you've done is you've given it a label. So when you can name a tree, then the illusion arises that now you know what that is. And you're no longer, at that moment, you're no longer sensing the miracle and the mystery and the hidden dimension of that tree. Because now you think you know. You've put a label on it. But even the tree has great depths. Even there's more to the tree than what you see on the surface. Even the tree is connected to the source of all life. Never lost its connection to the source of all life, out of which all forms arise. So when you look at a tree in the state of not knowing, not imposing pseudo-knowledge, you can use the words when you need them, but don't go through life burdened by concepts and words. Then everything in nature has a depth to it that you can sense, and that is one with your own depths. So, in other words, you sense the sacredness of the tree through your own sacredness. And sacredness is the formless within you. Sacredness is the timeless and formless within you. And you are that. The modern world doesn't know what to do with the word sacred. It says, what does that mean? That's you know what it means directly. I don't need to give you a definition. The moment you become still, you know what sacred means. And the moment you perceive nature through the stillness within, rather than through conceptualization, you know that everything in nature is sacred. And the moment you perceive another human being through the stillness within, rather than through imposing a judgment, you know that every human being is sacred. With that comes an enormous respect for life, the form, and essentially, and more importantly, the formless essence of all life. And that's what you see when you walk around nature. And you cannot expect somebody who is totally identified with mind to see the sacredness, because they haven't found that dimension within themselves. So when they go out into nature, they either see only their own knowledge, if they have it, and they call this is the tree such and such, and it does that and that. Or they have some other perspective. They say, okay, this tree would be worse if I cut it down, it'll be worth such and such. That's all they can't see. They can go to an ancient forest, which is one of the most sacred places you can find, an ancient old growth forest. And all they see is, okay, that would be worth a lot of money. Timber, we can cut that down. It's completely in the mind only. So here, be the stillness for what you perceive. Animals, the weather, you can be the space for that. The weather is so incredible here. Continuous change. Sun comes, rain comes, sun comes, rain comes, clouds come, blue sky comes. The air, moist, warm. If you live here, perhaps you don't notice it anymore. It comes with familiarity. If you're visiting, it's wonderful to embrace all the experiences here, but don't lose yourself in the experiences. Don't label the experiences, just experience and be the space for the experience. So you're rooted, you're the stillness for all that. Wonderful practice, living in that way. moment of stillness. Beautiful. Not that the stillness wasn't here already, even while the words were being spoken. Of course, they came out of stillness, and they were received through the stillness. And what remains then is just that.